A bunch of people would tell me like, oh, I want these founders who are coachable. I'm like, why? I just want people who are right and make good decisions. If they don't need any coaching from me to do that, I'm okay with that. And I have a few founders where I would just say like, we have a very arm's length relationship. When they need something, they reach out to me and they make a really clear ask and I do it. And then I don't hear from them again until like the next inflection point where they need something. And like, I wish there were more warmth there, but I think they're getting what they need from me. And I guess this is the other thing, Elliot, like I think my job is to give people what they need from me. And so I believe like if we show up and do what we said we would do for people and like we're not annoying and we're helpful, that like over time, like we will build good relationships with the majority of founders that we work with. Maybe not everybody, but the vast majority.
Hi, and welcome to Minimum Viable Podcast, where we go beyond the surface to explore the depths of product creation. Think of this as a masterclass in innovation, combining deep insights, perspectives, hands-on analysis, where we'll cover topics like the psychology of user behavior and the aesthetics of design and the timeless principles of storytelling. I'm your host, Elliot Popple, and the founder of General Collaboration. General Collaboration is a cross-app inbox for all of your comments from all of the tools that you use at work. So that way you'll always be focused on what needs your attention most. Without further ado, let's dive into today's episode.
Hey, Charles. So we met back in 2022 when I was fundraising for General Collaboration, raising our pre-seed round. And I'm so grateful to have you, to have Precursor on my cap table right now. Thinking back to then, I'd heard such great things about working with you, specifically the relationship that you have with founders after you're on the other side of the table. You're on the cap table. We all know this trope, this like stereotypical VC, and I'd heard that you were basically the opposite of that, and that's proven to be true. And that's it is, and you have this incredible reputation for being truly like the anti that asshole guy. And I really want to dig into that and the relationship that you have with founders today. So maybe before we can jump into that, like just some context setting. I know I probably asked you this 2 years ago, but what makes you and Precursor different? Like, how do you typically answer that when a founder asks at the fundraising stage?
Elliot, venture's a weird business because it's like you take money from these people with expectations. And if they don't meet your expectations, it's not like you can be like, I want my money back. Like most of those transactions are pretty easy to reverse. This one isn't. And I started asking myself a bunch of questions, I was at Uncork before and InQtel. I kept asking myself, like, where have I seen these relationships go wrong? One area where they go wrong, I've seen quite often, is VCs overpromising what they can actually do for founders. And I said, okay, so let's not overpromise what we're going to deliver. And it's not like a underpromise and overdeliver. Like, let's just be honest about what we can actually do to help founders. And we could talk about that at some point. And we have, as you know, like I try to keep that like very narrow in scope down. Like these are the specific areas I think I can help you. Anything above that is probably a bonus. Then there's a bunch of little things. Like, for example, I feel like VCs taking credit for founders' accomplishment really grinds founders' gears. So I tell our team, we're not going to be the ones. Look at how genius we were for backing Elliot. Yes, he sold GC for $1 billion, but it's only because of our wise, sage advice and vision to back it. That's annoying. So like, don't do that. And third, this is one that took me a long time to realize, is I think venture capital is still a business. And I think you want the people, or at least I want the people who take our money, and to understand the business that we're in. The business that we're in is in trying to find far outlier companies. And that means sometimes we will have to deliver hard feedback to people that we like based on the progress or lack of progress in the business. And I was just like, it's easier to just be honest with people on that front and like tell them like, hey, I can't give you money, or I choose not to give you money for these reasons. And I think this is probably the big one. And we're not perfect. Simply get back to people. Like if somebody takes the time to share their like dream or vision with you about what they want to build, get back to them with an answer, ideally within the time frame that's relevant, which for me is usually a couple weeks. And like simply tell them what you decided and why. And like it's like you're going to be wrong. And I just felt like if you treated, it's funny, a lot of VCs like founders are the most important people in this whole equation. Without founders, I'd have no business. I'm like, well, then why do you treat them so poorly? Like, why did you treat them so poorly? Like in most businesses, if you treated your customer this poorly, they would like not be. And I think the truth is like, there's like the what you say and what you do in venture. And so I always said like, I want a venture firm where even people who don't get money from us will walk away being like, those people treated me fairly. I got an audience. They showed up. They weren't on their phone the whole time, like not paying attention. And in the end, they told me something that feels honest about why they're not investing in the business, whether I agree with them or not. And I felt like if we could do that, people's experience dealing with us would feel different. And so those are kind of the core principles I set out. And it was more that I was like, I think this is what founders deserve than it is like, I want to put myself in opposition to like what other people do. And I felt, like I said, we're not perfect. There are things that fall through the cracks here. And there are people where I feel like I wish they'd walked away with a better impression of our firm. But I try really hard to live up to those expectations from founders. And also, like one other thing I realize is a lot of VCs like don't tell founders the truth after the fact. And like, I don't know, I've always felt I want what I call long-term friends. A long-term friend is someone you can have a disagreement with or have a bad day with and it doesn't end the friendship. And I felt like I've been on boards and I've been involved with companies where as soon as the founder logs off the Zoom, all the VCs are like, well, this one's going to zero. And you're like, well, none of us told the founder on that call our perception of the gravity of the situation that they're in. And I think what happens is in the short term, there's like limited value to direct and honest feedback that isn't helpful or isn't what the founder wants to hear. But in the long term, I think the value to having relationships that are fundamentally built on honesty with founders is much, much greater.
Tell me more about that. So you're saying in the short term, like that investor in that scenario is like, well, there's really nothing I can say to fix this. So I'd rather just ho-hum, not say anything. Like why is an investor that way?
I think there's no upside. Like, I think what we should have told that person is you're in a lot of trouble. Your company's like not financeable at the moment and you're unlikely to get money from us. The first person to say that will probably be the person that the founder remembers. And everyone else will be like, now that you mentioned it, I kind of feel the same way. So like going out first with a tough message, the short-term gains are, in my opinion, basically non-existent. In many cases, founders are like, oh, I didn't want to hear that, or like, you jerk. Like, why would you say that about my business? And that's where I think like trying to be good at communications is really important. But I've certainly had cases where founders have gotten to the end and been like, well, when did you know this wasn't going to work out? And you're like, oh, 9 months ago. And like, well, why didn't anybody tell me 9 months ago that from the point of view of someone outside looking in, it looks like this isn't going to work. I might have done something different. And the question is, oftentimes the feeling is like, it's hard to tell people that message. Unless you're like this, and this is the end of our relationship. It's like, hey, I'm going to tell you right now, I think we have an unfundable company unless we change something pretty dramatic in the next 3 months. The next time we check in and hang out, you're going to remember, oh, last time he told me that I'm kind of cooked. But I feel like I'd rather tell you that and say like, you have 3 or 4 more months to turn this thing around and get the company to a place where it isn't in trouble. But if you do nothing, this is what I think is going to happen. And early in my venture career, I was very unwilling to have those conversations with people because I'm like, there's really no upside. The upside is that like you give people a chance to fix the thing that's broken and you give them a chance to see the world through your lens as an investor. And oftentimes I talk to founders who are like, you told me something. I didn't really want to hear it. It landed and I've been thinking about it. And now I look at my business, I kind of see what you mean. And I didn't see it until you said it. And I'm like, good, that was my goal. My goal wasn't to make you feel bad. My goal was to help you like see something that I felt like you either weren't seeing or we weren't acknowledging.
How do you build a relationship where you've got, I assume it's not every portfolio company where you have your finger on the pulse at that level. What type of communication are you having? What sort of relationship are you having with founders that get you in a position where you're able to get that gut feel of whether things are going to go great or not so great?
I should probably turn around and ask you. I can tell you like the principles that I actually am curious to hear from your point of view. Like my view is I go into these assuming that nobody trusts me or knows me if we haven't worked together. And that was like a big unlock for me was like, if I assume that nobody trusts me or knows me, then I have to like earn their trust. And I think you can't say hard, at least I can't, I shouldn't say you can't. I generally find it's difficult to say hard things to people if there isn't some bank of trust that's been built up in previous times. So I think it's my job to build a relationship where you feel like I can say something to Charles and hopefully he's not going to tear my head off or judge me. Or I can admit to it a mistake and he's not going to say I told you so. Or I can bring him an unfinished thought and he's not going to be like, Elliot, why are you bringing me this work in process? Like, go figure it out. And I think like for a lot of investors, a lot of us are like in the like, let's make decision mode. And I find like part of this is like giving people space to like bring you stuff. I find most people will test you out. They'll bring you something that's like neutral to slightly bad news to see how you react. And if you're just like, oh my God, I can't believe that thing happened, like you numbskull. Like if you come down hard on somebody on a small thing, like why would they trust you with something much weightier?
So that's typically how like that initial transition happens, is the founders sort of testing the waters. They're going to tell you a little bit of the truth and see how you react, and if you can handle the full truth.
I also just think like I am genuinely interested in getting to know all the founders we back as people. Because in most cases, like, I mean, I didn't know you really well before we started. I'm like, I kind of want to get to know them as people. And part of it is like, I'm willing to share, as you know, parts of my own life too, when people ask. And I think it's hard to like ask other people to share if you're this like stoic VC who like never reciprocates or never even initiates a conversation where you open up and share or provide feedback. But my hope is that like when I talk to people, it creates a space where eventually they feel like this is the place where I can like talk about things, where I can like be a human is the main thing. Like, yes, I'm an investor, but like I'm also a human and I'm dealing with companies that are run by humans. So like if we can have a human interaction, we'll probably do a better job solving the challenges that face a company too.
Is that something you're screening for? Like at the initial phases, is that one of your criteria? Is like, is this someone that I feel like I'm going to be able to connect with in this way? Or
honestly, no. And I think when I started the fund, there a bunch of people would tell me like, oh, I want these founders who are coachable. I'm like, why? I just want people who are right and make good decisions. If they don't need any coaching from me to do that, I'm okay with that. And I have a few founders where I would just say like, we have a very arm's length relationship. When they need something, they reach out to me and they make a really clear ask and I do it. And then I don't hear from them again until like the next inflection point where they need something. And like, I wish there were more warmth there, but I think they're getting what they need from me. And I guess this is the other thing, Elliot, like in the beginning, I was like, I think my job is to give people what they need from me. Some people will want more. They will want like a human relationship. They will want more depth. They will want more interaction. And other people just won't. They will want something that feels less rich, maybe slightly more transactional. And like my job is to like give people what they want, but always leave the door open for people to have more if they want it. And we've had some founders who've started off like, I'm going to send you a monthly update and like I will call you when I need something. And then they called me when they needed something and we talked about it and like, this was useful. Thank you. I'm like, you can do this as often as you like. It doesn't have to be just the like, you know, capital B big stuff. And again, I think, I don't know, I'm an optimist. And so I believe like if we show up and do what we said we would do for people and like we're not annoying and we're helpful, that like over time, like we will build good relationships with the majority of founders that we work with. Maybe not everybody, but the vast majority.
Is there anything specifically that you feel like founders that you've worked with, or you see founders that maybe you don't work with, what do people do to get the most out of their investors, their stakeholders, their network at large? And what those who don't, where are they failing?
It's a really good question. I think there's an art to activating your network. And I think I can tell you the people that are the easiest ones to help are the ones who tell me where they need help and where that help feels like it's aligned to something that's really important for the business. So if someone's like, hey, we're trying to like build this back-end payment system. We've never done this before. We're really looking to talk to 2 to 3 people who've done it. I'm like, that's a pretty specific ask and it feels pretty important. when someone's like, we're looking for an iOS engineer, like I'm like, okay, that's like kind of important, but that's like kind of at the level of I expect you as the founder to be able to execute that task, even if I like miss the email and can't help. So I always try to think about like, is this an area where I can provide leverage to a founder on the ask, and where that leverage will help them solve some problem that feels like big and meaty. Versus, yeah. So I think like saying like, hey, we're looking for someone who's like built a payments system before, ideally for one of these 5 companies. That's pretty easy for me to like figure out, well, who do I know at one of these 5 companies? If someone's just like, I want to talk to someone who knows something about payments. I'm like, okay, well, like it's a little more amorphous, and I don't really know why. So I think giving investors the context on like, I'm asking for help. I'm asking for your help on this kind of specific ask, and here's why it's important. I find that people, and look, investors, there's a little bit of a Pavlov, like it's nice to see yourself in the shout outs as being like, this person was helpful. Like it feels good.
One thing that stands out to me, especially at like the earliest stages where you're investing, is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but typically you don't have a board seat, right?
No.
And with that, it kind of plays this parallel to my experience as a PM, to so many others' experience as a PM, that there's kind of had this like leadership without authority thing going on, where it's, how do you influence when you can't actually tell someone what to do? I'm sure even once you have a board seat, there's still a lot of nuance to that as well. But how do you approach that?
I always ask myself, like, do I have permission to provide this person with feedback in this domain? And sometimes I conclude the answer is no, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes I'm like, this person simply knows more about the problem than I do. And whatever genius idea I have, I'm sure they like actually probably already thought about it. And they're much more of a subject matter expert than I am, so maybe I don't have permission. In other cases, it's like the relationship's not in a place where I can bring this up. And a lot of times I'll have a thought in a meeting and I ask myself, like, is this the right time to bring this up with this person? And I'm like, probably not. I'm going to put this on the shelf and we will come back to this if this is still an issue the next time I talk to them. But I start with that, like, do I have permission to even like weigh in? And then the question is like always, why? So a couple of days ago, a founder who's winding down her company like sent me this like self-reflection that she wrote, which I thought was actually like quite good. I've written those before for myself when I've like shut companies down and things like that. And I thought about it, I'm like, something's nagging me about this. And I was like, how good? And I was like, she and I have a very good relationship. Like I think we will be friends forever. And so I just wrote her back. I was like, yeah, I'm taking a risk here, but like, I think there's probably like another level of depth to this self-reflection that you need not share with me, but that I hope you've written for yourself, because this one's a little bit more tidy than I would emotionally tidy than I would expect for someone who's in the midst of like shutting down their company. And I just hope you gave yourself a place and space to write down like something that feels a little more raw. And I feel like I could say that to her because we have a good relationship. I wouldn't have said that to somebody where we weren't close. And she's like, oh yeah, I have one of those too. And it was like a really good conversation that we had on email just about that feeling of like the things you say to yourself when you're shutting a company down versus like what you publish on Medium or Substack or your publishing venue of choice. And I felt like I could say that to her because of the relationship we have. So I'm always asking myself, like, who am I to say this? Like, just because I put money in the company doesn't mean you have to listen to me. I think the other thing that I learned when I was a junior VC is your words are like pretty powerful when you're an investor. So like, make sure you pick your spots carefully. And I was on a board where like during a board meeting, like one of the VCs was very animated about a product feature. And we spent 10 minutes like debating this product feature and the company changed it.
Just on that advice.
I did. The CEO never said that was like the reason, but I was like, it looked like this before the board meeting. It looked like this after. And I don't think that person who gave that feedback was like a product guru. And I think it was like the positional authority that person had as a board member meant that those comments had extra weight. And so I'm always thinking like, if I say this, like what might the company do with this feedback? And how do I like deliver? As you can probably tell, like I try to think a lot before I say stuff because I'm just like, once I say this, once Elliot hears it, he's going to do something with whatever I said. And I want to at least have thought through, like, how do I say this in such a way that it doesn't feel like I'm being directive or prescriptive, unless that's actually my intent.
So how do you approach thinking to the conversations that we're having? So we catch up once a month, and most of those conversations are me saying, we're going to iterate this in this little way. And thankfully for GC so far, or maybe this will come to bite me in the ass. We haven't had a big pivot yet, but
yeah.
how do you approach? You really are one of the key resources that a founder has, especially a founder at a PM, like wearing that PM hat, has in navigating all the little iterations en route to finding those early signs of product market fit. How do you approach that?
One nice thing about being an investor who's not a board member is I like to think in most of our companies, I'm close enough to the company that you don't have to remind me what you do and I know what GC does. But I'm not in the weeds every day trying to make these really hard product decisions that you and I have discussed on many of our I could not do your job, to be clear. And it also, I have like this range, this like 2-dimensional range of like 200 plus active portfolio companies that I've been working with in some cases for 7 or 8 years. So we have this like 2-dimensional view. And sometimes I'm just like, oh, this kind of reminds me of something I've seen before. This like reminds me of something I've seen before around someone who's like trying to get the product right. So I'm always thinking like, okay, how long have we been struggling with this problem? And does it feel like we're getting forward motion, or does it feel like we're like spinning our wheels? And I listen, and sometimes I'm like, I think what this person needs is just more time and space to figure this out. They don't actually need anything they don't need advice from me, maybe a little encouragement, but they don't need advice from me. They're like doing everything right. In other cases, I'm like, wow, I think I know somebody who I've worked with who's been in the same situation and got through it. Maybe that person in a founder to founder conversation can unlock something for this person that I cannot in this founder to investor. And sometimes I'm just like, this person is like spinning or flailing and maybe they don't see it. And maybe this is the time for me to say, hey, we've been like stuck on this thing for a really long time. And it doesn't feel like we're getting closer to the answer. That's what it feels like from my point of view. Like, how does it feel from your point of view? And I think sometimes you do have to take the risk and like state things like that. Like I had someone else, I'm like, this is our 3rd VP of marketing. What have we not gotten? Like, what have we not figured out about the type of marketer that's going to work in our company? I'm not saying it's all our fault, but I'm also not saying it's 100% the candidate. It's like, we're missing something here. Like what are we missing now that we've taken like 3 swings? And, I felt like that needed to be said when the 3rd person left. Not to blame the CEO, but to say as a group, we like are missing something here. And we pretty quickly figured out what it was. But yeah, I don't know.
Are there any stories you can share of like times where you feel like you've managed to have a really outsized impact, whether that's positive or negative, on a company through your advice?
Oh, I can think of one. I can think of one really big negative one. I have to decide if I could psych myself up to tell that story. I can tell you like one that I didn't think was that. This is what's weird, Elliot. Like I always tell my investors, I might talk to you 10 or 12 times this year. I won't know which ones really mattered until the end of the year looking back. There might be 1 or 2 conversations we have. I go, wow, but the benefit of hindsight, that one was actually like kind of important. So I have this company in our portfolio called Campus. They're basically building the world's best online community college. Without getting to all of the like pivots, the business basically started off as Slack for the classroom. And this is 6 years ago, maybe longer. I don't know. My times along. This was a very early investment we made 6 or 7 years ago, and they were competing with this company called Piazza, and like they had all these things they were building. And then during COVID, he built like an online instruction platform. I'll never forget. It was Christmas break. I was walking down 24th Street in Noe Valley, and I get a call from the CEO, and he's like, "I have this idea for this online community college," and he walked me through the whole thing about like why community college is like one of the worst, no offense, like hyper local products you can buy, because if you're not lucky enough to live in a place that has an excellent community college, you're not going to uproot yourself and your family to go. You take what's available, and it's like kind of not a great deal for the people who teach either. And the TLDR was, he told me the whole thing, and he's like, "What do you think?" And he's like, "Well, to make this work, we have to buy a school." I said, "Well, of course you do." He's like, "Let me tell you why you have to buy a school." I'm like, No. You have to buy a school." He's like, "Well, what do you mean?" I go, "No, I agree with you. Like based on what you've told me and how long it will take for us to get accredited, you have to buy a school." He's like, "I got on this call thinking I was gonna have to like." I was like, "No, you should buy a school. This is 100% the like optimal way to do this." And he's like, "Oh, I like really thought I was going to have to sell you up." I was like, no. This is like obviously a really good idea. And it's actually the only way you can quickly realize this vision, because the time required to get accreditation is just, it's going to take you too long. And he's talked about this before. He's like, that conversation was important to him because like he's like, "Yeah, your immediate identification that this was the right thing to do." I have another portfolio company that makes a physical product, and I gave them a very strong encouragement to vertically integrate. At the time when the CEO was starting to think about it, I'm like, "You have to do this. Like, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think you have to do this. And if you don't do this, it's like existential for your company. I'm not saying you should do this because it's easy. I'm saying you should do this because if you don't do this, like, you might find yourself in a position where like you don't control your own destiny." And that CEO, I think it's funny. The CEO says, "I always call you when I have something aggressive because you're the one who always tells me to do the aggressive thing." I'm like, it's not that I tell you to do the aggressive thing. It's just I think the aggressive things you bring to me happen to be the right decisions for the business. And so there have been a couple times, but I think in most cases, if I have 2 impactful conversations a year with the founder, I feel like I'm like doing a great job.
When a founder comes to you with one of these conversations, or with the beginning of one of these conversations, is there something they can do to set themselves up for success having that with you? Like obviously there was a lot of thought that went into that campus conversation you just talked about. It's vertical integration one.
I think these conversations go well in 2 cases. One case is like, I've decided to do something and I want to know what I'm not seeing about it, but like I'm actually not asking for your permission. I'm actually asking for your feedback and perspective. Those are actually easy for me to have. I'm like, "You're going to do this already. So let's talk about like how you do this in a way that like gives you the maximum bang for the buck." The other ones are, but I'd say that's the minority. That's maybe 10%. I'd say 90% of the time, Elliot, we get on Zoom or on the phone and the person's like, I'm trying to make a decision. And 3 minutes in, I'm like, "I think you've already made a decision." Like the tone of this conversation suggests to me that like you already have an inkling about what to do. Either like we're doing a Socratic exercise, or it's more obvious to me than it is to you that you've already made. And a lot of times they're just like, "I guess you're right." A lot of times I think they, just in the way they talk to me about the, I'm like, you've already made up your mind what you're going to do. You just haven't connected the dots that's what you've done. And I'm happy to be like the forcing function or the like mirror that helps them see like you've already decided you're going in this direction. Just by the way you framed the choices or the way you talk about your options. And sometimes founders are like, "Oh, yeah, I guess you're right. I kind of have." I'm like, your half-hearted defense of option B makes me think you don't even think it's a good idea. So the real case is like, how do we? But I think it's like, I also just think it's okay for people to bring me things where they legitimately haven't made up their mind, so long as they're not asking me to make the decision for them. That's the one thing that like I won't do. And I think that's like when CEOs ask me to do that, I get really concerned.
CEOs will like literally say, which one should I do? And
like, what should I do? And I'm like, I don't know. I can tell you what I would do if I were in your shoes, but that's different than what you should do.
How do you flip back? So we talked a little bit, we've been talking a bit about like that flip from I'm pitching you to now you're my investor, but eventually I need your pro rata. So
yeah,
kind of flips back again. How does that whole experience tend to go for you? Because you are such an interpersonal, like so I think about my investors and I get something unique out of each of the investors that I have. I'm really grateful for the relationships that I have. I feel like the relationship that I get to have with you is like borderline therapy at times, which must make it really awkward when I need something from my therapist in a few months. And, they know exactly everything wrong.
This is like, if I think about all of the areas where I'd like to think we've evolved the most as a firm, it's this very conversation you brought up. And look, I started my fund in 2015. In 2015, from 2015 to 2020, there were very few difficult follow-on conversations because the market was up and to the right. And if I didn't do it, no founder cared because they were 3x oversubscribed for their round anyway. So like not doing the ones you didn't want to do wasn't a hard conversation. And we run a small fund, so not getting to do follow-ons for me wasn't also a hard conversation. And what I realized is there's this fine line to connect the dots on some things between like the business of venture capital and the fact that we want to have, honest relationships with founders. And the honesty has to go two ways. And I think we had gotten to a place where we were so focused on building good relationships and we hadn't had to give people bad news. I don't think we were that great at it. And I think for some people, they're just like, wait a minute, but you like me and now you're telling me you're not going to give me money. And I was like, I had never like created the conditions where the person would start thinking about this until they made the ask. So a lot of people came in being like, so what can I put you down for? And I was like, 0. They're like, yeah, but what numbers are to the left of that 0? I'm like, none. And I think we really caught some people off guard because I hadn't had the conversation with them about like, hey, here's how I think about follow-on investing. And we've gotten better. We are not where I want us to be in this conversation. And I think, as you can imagine, it's really emotionally charged, particularly as our checks have gotten bigger. When we were little, nobody cared. Like, whatever, your little pro rata doesn't matter. Now, we write a decent sized check. And so I think it's my duty to get in front of that conversation so that when someone comes to me to talk about their next round, whatever I tell them should only be a positive surprise. People shouldn't be like, oh, wow, I thought you were, what's hard though? I have some founders where we don't talk that often. We're not that close. I don't feel like I have that much insight on the business. And it's not about liking them. It's when they come to ask me for a product, I'm like, this isn't a business I know that much about. So now I'm looking at like the external signals. How much money have you spent? Where are you in terms of traction? I don't have a lot of insight on how you got here because I don't have like a relationship with the founder that would help me like fill in the gaps. And so for those, like, it ends up being a more arm's length exercise of like, oh, this is a business that appears to be doing well. Maybe we should continue to invest. Versus this is a business that's on the cusp of doing well. And I know that because I know what's happened in the last 90 days and I have confidence in the CEO. And so I try really hard to make sure that and the good news is because most of our portfolio companies share financial runway data with us, I kind of know, okay, if this company has 9 months of runway, I probably need to make a decision about would I put more money into this company if they asked. And the answers are usually absolutely, maybe, and no. And the maybes are weird because the maybes are usually like, well, we need $2 million to get to the next milestone. I would be part of a $2 million round, but I wouldn't give them $500K on my own. And so now what I try to do is I'm like, okay, they have 9 months runway. We are probably going to start talking about fundraising soon. How do I get in front of this conversation? And I'll just tell people like, hey, I want to talk about the next raise. We have 9 months of cash. We're a ways out. We probably only have 3 months left to change the business. If we don't change the business in 3 months, we basically kind of have the company we're going to fundraise for. What do we like? Let's talk about like what that company looks like and like what some of the challenges might be around fundraising.
Any advice that you give to founders as they're approaching that conversation with you or with others, or maybe even more importantly, like what advice for that opposite of UVC that we were talking about earlier? How do you approach it with that?
I just wish like companies asked more often, like, how do you think this is going? I have one person like at the end of every check-in, he's like, how do you think we're doing on a scale of 1 to 10? Or sometimes they'll say, what percentile are we in your portfolio based on our current performance? And I'm always like, since you ask me every time, it's not a binding number. It's not like a binding number. And I would always argue like it's good to know two things. And I think in this environment in particular, does your cap table have more? Like, do they actually have money to give you? Is there a financial vehicle like a fund or personal balance sheet that is available to tap if you were to make the ask? And two, like, how would you grade the quality of your relationship with that investor? Because I do think like it is hard to say no to a founder that you really like, who you've observed working hard, who you think's making progress. And I don't think every follow-on decision is this like rational, formulaic, quantitative exercise. It's a mix of like quantitative data and qualitative data. And the qualitative data either works for you or against you. It's almost never neutral. And so I think one advantage is of like if you have good relationships with your investors, like they'll either write you a check that maybe their head says they shouldn't, but their heart says they want to, or ideally they'll tell you why they're not going to participate. And that's been really important for the last 2 years.
Shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to ask you about your thoughts on hiring, on recruiting, and especially from the employee's perspective. One of the things that you've been really helpful to me with is when we have been trying to close hires, that I send some people to you for. It's an interview, but it's for you to suss them out, but it's also for you to be able to position the company a bit and help them come in eyes wide open. What advice would you give, especially on like the product leader side, whether it's product or design or dev, these early hires at the sorts of startups that you back? What advice would you give those people?
I think I have this like internal rubric where like most hiring, crudely speaking, is about 50% candidate talent assessment and 50% like will they work out in your environment. I think most startup recruiting failures that I see are not usually talent and ability assessment fails. If I see those make me nervous. I will go back to someone and be like, wow, we've hired 2 engineers that like couldn't get their development environment up and running and like couldn't make a board. Like this is bad. Like we're missing on the part that should be consistent. And I think like the thing that I am like very empathetic about is it's very hard to know what works in your culture as a startup until you've like hired a fair number of people. And sometimes you figure out what works by hiring people who don't work and just saying, oh, I think I kind of know why that person wasn't successful here. They had A, B, and C attribute. Maybe we should just be aware that attribute maybe doesn't play well with the culture and team that we have at the moment. Doesn't mean we won't have it later, and doesn't mean that we won't intentionally inject it at some point if we need it. But we should know that like people with like A, B, and C style or skills or outlook don't seem to work well here. I think the other thing is people from companies that have been successful, it is very difficult sometimes to figure out whether they were actually any good.
Tell me more about that.
Like I've definitely like interviewed people from some. I think with like big tech companies, it's a very different issue. It's just that like startup life and like Google, Meta, whatever life is just very different, both in terms of resources, and style. I've definitely though like met people who like were salespeople at a company at a time where the product was selling like crazy, and I'm like, how much of this was skill at selling, and how much of this was skill at identifying a good company to join at a good time? Because both are skills. And I've had a couple of cases where we hired somebody who was very successful at a company that was on a steep ramp when they were there. And I'm just like, maybe the ramp was carrying the person, not the person driving the ramp. And I've seen that in marketing and I've seen it in sales. A product, you don't see it as much. Product, I think the other issue you get is that like people worked on a product that was really successful, but you're like, but what was their contribution to that product? Where was that product in its life cycle when they joined that team? The TLDR is, I think, recruiting is really hard. And as long as you're not consistently failing on ability, then I'm pretty patient with founders in going through the process of like trying to figure out who works best in our company and what's the profile of people we should be looking for who kind of can come here and thrive.
Any tactics for how you find those people? I feel like one of the hiring has always been a challenge for me, and maybe challenge is the wrong word. We do a decent job at it, but it's something that I always have to put a lot of effort into. And in particular, it's you need the stars to align just right. You need like the right level of challenge and opportunity for someone, but the people who you want won't necessarily be willing to take the risk, and you're managing your runway and how much risk is that person willing to take? Are there any advice that you give to people to trying to build out teams at that early stage?
Yeah, and this is very stage specific. So, I give different advice to our Series B and C companies than I do to our seed and pre-seed companies. Almost every really successful startup I've been a part of has someone that we euphemistically refer to as startup gold. It's somebody you found whose like performance and potential greatly exceeds your expectations. And I can think of a few people I've worked with. There's a guy who I worked with at this company called Vungle. This guy, Ben Baer, he was like startup gold at Vungle. He turned out to be an incredible sales leader and has also turned out to be a great CEO. I was on the board of a company called Kahuna, and we had this first salesperson, like Mercy Bell, who was just an incredible seller. And like, I think what I've seen the most successful CEOs in our portfolio do is strategically take risk on people where they see something in the person's upside and potential. And like, they just get good at spotting these people who, for that stage of the company's life, are exactly what you need. And they end up having capacity to go farther than you thought they would. Versus like hiring the person, like this person can scale from today to IPO. I'm like, they probably can't actually. And I think getting comfortable with the idea that like you will hire people today that will be incredibly effective for your company for the next 24 months and then will not fit if they don't grow and develop. And I think like getting comfortable with that notion that like I'm hiring for the people who will make sense in the current context. It's really hard because everyone's like, oh, I don't want to have to do this again in 24 months.
That's the
I want
job.
my forever CTO. I want my forever product leader. And I'm like, well, you might get them. But it's actually more important to find somebody who can deal with a pre-product market fit company with some signals and some messy data. Like you need that person today. And you need that person today for the next 24 months. You might get to a place where what you really need is someone who's really skilled at like managing a group of product managers. That is the wrong person for today. And so getting founders to understand, like, how do I find the person whose skills, abilities, and experience? And the funny thing is that what that often means is that like the resumes of early people that we hire in our startups, they're actually not always that impressive.
So is it mostly gut feel, like those diamonds in the rough that you're talking about?
I think, and maybe you've had this experience, I think the most valuable criteria for these like these 1 to 5 person stage companies is the ability to be in that environment and enjoy it. It has to be something that's energized. And the number of people I've interviewed who've been like, I really want to be in an early stage company. I'm like, so you want to run into the burning building? Like, that's what you want to do? That's yeah, I want it. And they get there like, oh my God, this is so chaotic. I'm like, what were you expecting? They're like, chaos, but not this. I'm like, oh, that's actually a pretty well run company for 5 people. Like, if you think that's chaos, like, you really shouldn't be here. And I think the challenge is candidates who've never been in the 0 to 1 environment, they don't really know what it's like. So I actually don't blame those people when they make mistakes, because they have a vision of themselves and a vision of the job, and those two things don't always line up. Whereas I think if you find people who've done startups, like, I'm always nervous about people where a 0 to 1 stage startup is their first meaningful startup experience. And I was like, wow, this is going to be the shock to the system to you coming from Adobe or whatever. Like, this is a big gap. Versus someone who's been in and around a handful of early stage startups. I'm like, this person has like seen the belly of the beast, and they're choosing to like run back into the burning building yet again. And I think like in many cases, like those early employees, like their commitment to the mission, their commitment to their teammates, and their like ability to thrive in these environments means that at 100 people, they might be like, I hate it here now. Like, there's all this bureaucracy. Like, I got to fill out forms, and like, I don't want to do that. I just want to like hack. I want to build. And like, that's the sad part, is sometimes those people don't scale with you. That's who I was as an employee. I was the like, I like it 0 to 30. I can deal with it like up to 50. And like, you get bigger than that. I'm like, oh, too much process. This is like, it's too hard. And I just like learned that about myself. I'm like, I like small companies, and I like it for the camaraderie and like the shared sense of purpose, and the fact that you kind of know what everybody else is doing, and you can keep the caliber bar really high for the people you work with. And I'm like, that's what I like.
Charles, this has been such an awesome conversation. Just like all of our conversations, being able to really dive into like both these decisions, these questions that founders, that product people ask themselves, but also like how it weighs on us and how we have to think through those things, and how we present it to other people. Thank you so much for hanging out today. I really appreciate it.
This was so fun. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again. See you later.
Yep.